Rien rattled against the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's like à tous en restless fingé.
The old church smelled of damp stone and lilies, grief's usual perfume. I tightened my grip on the black lace gloves my mother had given me that morning, as if fabric alone could keep my chest from splintering. The service had begun only minutes ago, but the air already felt heavy, swollen with unspoken memories. My father's photograph rested atop the mahogany casket, the same half-smile that used to soften his scoldings. For 27 years I'd believed I knew every shadow and shine of that smile. Then the great oak door moaned. Every head turned. A woman stood framed by the storm outside, tall, coat-soaked, a single crimson rose trembling in her hand. The wind lifted her raven hair like a dark banner. She was a stranger to me, yet her eyes, grey as the English Channel, searched the aisle with an intimacy that belonged only to family. Mother stiffened beside me, her fingernails biting into my sleeve. "Who?" she whispered, but her voice collapsed before the question finished. The stranger stepped inside, water dripping from the hem of her coat. She did not hesitate. She did not scan for a seat. She moved as though she knew the path by heart, straight to the casket. The priest faltered mid-psalm. The hush that followed could have cracked stone.
He rose without thinking, my chair scraping the marble floor in a shriek.
The woman reached the coffin and laid the rose gently across the polished wood. Her gloved fingers lingered on the brass handle, an almost lover's touch. Then, in a whisper meant only for the dead, she breathed, "Good night, my love."
My briscocht.
No one else moved. My mother's hand slipped from my arm as if strength had drained from her. In that single heartbeat, the father I thought I knew, the man of bedtime stories and Sunday walks, shattered into someone else entirely. The rain had been falling since dawn, a steady silver curtain that blurred the hedgerows and soaked the cobblestones of Harrowby Lane. By the time Mother and I reached St. Augustine's, the church stood like a dark ship in a grey sea. I tightened my scarf and tried to swallow the knot that had formed in my throat the moment we left the house. Father would have hated this weather. He'd always claimed the smell of wet stone clung to a man's clothes like regret. I caught myself almost turning to share that thought with him. Then the reality struck again. Father was the reason we were here, lying in a mahogany coffin beneath that ancient spire. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and damp wool. The pews creaked as neighbors and distant relatives shifted uncomfortably. The organist played something slow and mournful. Each note seemed to echo off the stone like a whispered accusation. I took my place beside Mother in the front row. Her hand, cold and thin, gripped mine with the desperate strength of someone trying not to drown. The black veil she wore fluttered when a draught wound its way through the nave. The priest began to speak, his voice low and even. I barely heard him. My eyes fixed on Father's photograph, that half-smile I'd known all my life, the one that softened every scolding and promised that the world, though harsh, could also be kind.
He clung to it like a life raft.
Then the great oak door at the back groaned open. Wind swirled through the church, carrying the smell of rain and the faint metallic tang of wet iron. Heads turned one by one, a slow ripple of curiosity and mild annoyance, until the woman stepped inside. Tall, straight-backed. A coat of deepest black, slick with rain, clung to her like a second skin. Raven hair fell in wet waves across her shoulders. In one hand she held a single crimson rose. Droplets of water slid from its petals and splattered onto the stone floor like drops of blood.
My bris snagged.
She wasn't from Harrowby, that much I knew. The town was small, strangers stood out like crows in a flock of doves. Yet she walked the central aisle as if she belonged to every memory we held of my father. Mother stiffened. Her nails dug into my wrist hard enough to hurt. "Who is that?" she hissed, her voice cracking on the last word. I had no answer. The stranger's grey eyes scanned the pews, sharp and searching, before settling on the casket. Her gaze softened, pain blooming across her face like a sudden bruise. She stopped at the foot of the coffin, bowed her head, and laid the rose gently across the polished wood. For a long moment she rested her gloved fingertips on the brass handle, a gesture so intimate it felt indecent in front of the congregation. Then she whispered, barely audible over the hush, "Good night, my love."
The organ faltered mid-note.
The priest's voice caught in his throat.
A chill rippled through me. My father's love?
The woman turned slightly, as if to leave, but the weight of every stair in the church pinned her where she stood. A murmur rose from the pews, neighbors with mouths half open, relatives leaning toward each other in disbelief. I stood before I knew I was moving. The scrape of my chair against stone sounded like a scream. Mother's hand shot out to stop me, then fell away.
The woman's eyes m'éminent.
For a heartbeat the world narrowed to that grey gaze, stormy and unyielding. Something in it made my stomach lurch, recognition, though I was certain we'd never met. I crossed the aisle, each step echoing like a drumbeat. The congregation's whispers swelled behind me, a sea of speculation. "You knew my father," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. The corners of her mouth twitched, grief, not amusement. "I did," she replied, her accent faintly French, the vowels soft as velvet.
"Better than most."
Mother gasped. I clenched my fists.
"And you are."
She hesitated. "A friend," she said finally, though the word sounded too small, too pale. "A friend doesn't call him my love at his funeral," I shot back. Her eyes glistened, but her chin remained high. "You are angry," she said, as though observing the weather. "You have every right."
Something inside me craqued. Angela said with a sudden, unwanted curiosity.
Who was this woman who could walk into our grief and claim a piece of the man I thought I knew? The priest cleared his throat, murmuring something about continuing the service. But no one moved. Mother's veil quivered. "Eleanor," she whispered to me, barely audible.
"Sit."
I turned to her. "You know her?" Mother's silence was answer enough. The stranger, this uninvited mourner, took a step closer.
"My name is Camille Laurent," she said quietly.
"I loved your father for 20 years.
A gasp rolled through the church like distant thunder.
I felt the ground tilt.
20 years.
My father had been married to my mother for 30. My mind raced, the late-night calls he'd stepped outside to take, the business trips that stretched longer than expected, the letters he kept locked in his desk. Camille continued, her voice breaking now. "He wanted to tell you. He wanted to tell all of you. But he feared the hurt."
My heart pounded against my rib, a frantic bird trapped in a cage.
For 27 years I had built my understanding of my father like a cathedral, each memory a stone, each lesson a beam of light. And in the span of a single storm-swept evening, that cathedral cracked. Everything I thought I knew collapsed into dust. The storm did not relent. By the time Camille's confession sank into the marrow of the congregation, the air inside St. Augustine's felt more suffocating than the rain outside. No one spoke, yet silence itself roared in my ears. Camille lowered her eyes, but not before I saw the sheen of tears gathering there. The priest cleared his throat, muttering a shaky prayer in Latin, as if holy words might stitch back the torn fabric of this moment. But the fabric of my family had already begun to unravel. Mother sat rigid, her veil trembling with each shallow breath. I wanted to reach for her hand to comfort her, but my own fingers trembled with betrayal and rage. My father, the man we were burying, had lived another life parallel to ours. A life with this woman.
A life built on ce créci.
I turned to face the pews. Dozens of eyes darted away from mine, neighbors, colleagues, relatives, each desperate to avoid the weight of my grief. Yet their whispers had already begun, curling through the church like smoke. "Who is she? 20 years, did you hear? Imagine poor Margaret, her husband, all this time." Their words struck me sharper than the toll of the funeral bells. They weren't just burying my father today, they were burying my image of him, dismantling it piece by piece. Camille remained at the casket, her hands folded, lips moving silently. I wanted to demand she leave, to cast her out into the storm, but my legs refused to obey. Something about her presence rooted me in place, infuriating and magnetic all at once. Then, from the back of the church, a cough. A man in a grey overcoat leaned toward his wife and whispered too loudly, shameless. "To show up here." Camille flinched. My chest burned. For a moment, I hated him more than her. It was my father's betrayal, not hers, and yet the scorn was directed solely at the woman left behind to carry his secret. The organ groaned back to life, the priest urging us to rise for a hymn. Wooden pews screeched as people obeyed, though their eyes remained fixed on the stranger.
"Il s'en nothing."
My throat was too dry. Instead, I studied Camille, her jaw clenched, her shoulders drawn back in quiet defiance. She bore the judgment of the town with a dignity that unnerved me. Halfway through the hymn, she turned abruptly and slipped into a side pew near the aisle. The congregation's collective sigh followed her, like wolves disappointed their prey had escaped. When the hymn ended, the priest resumed, voice cracking only once. I tried to focus on his words, but the whispers drowned them out. I saw heads leaning together, lips curling around scandal, and I realized this funeral had transformed from mourning into spectacle. I hated them for it. And I hated myself for the part of me that wanted to ask Camille everything, to tear the truth from her lips until nothing remained hidden. I leaned back, the wood cold against my spine. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, the storm was louder. And that was when the glances began to shift, not toward Camille, but toward me. A murmur rippled like wine through tall grass, subtle at first, then sharper, slicing through the priest's solemn intonations.
I kokt the darting look, quick, guilty glance landing squarely, on my mother and me.
Why us? Mother's shoulders stiffened, her knuckles white against her prayer book. The veil trembled as though it too sensed the growing suspicion. Do they think we knew? I whispered under my breath, though my voice was swallowed by the organ's low hum. A woman 2 pews ahead leaned toward her husband, their heads close, and I saw the faint curve of a smirk. A smirk, during my father's funeral. My stomach clenched, the bitter taste of humiliation rising like bile. Camille sat still, almost statuesque, yet her gaze flicked to me for the briefest second. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't apologetic. It was something stranger, like she was silently asking for my strength.
Or warning me.
The priest's final blessing droned on, his words distant as the storm beyond the stained glass windows. My pulse matched the rhythm of the rain, fast and unsteady. When the service ended, the congregation moved as one restless tide toward the doors. Black coats brushed against mine, hushed conversations swirled. She looks just like him, someone muttered behind me. Had to know, impossible she didn't. I spun, searching for the speaker, but the crowd swallowed them whole. Outside, the rain had softened to a cold drizzle, leaving the world a muted watercolor of gray and green. We followed the pallbearers to the gravesite. Wet earth clung to my shoes, the scent of damp soil mixed with lilies and something metallic, like blood. Camille appeared beside me, her umbrella a small fortress against the drizzle. She didn't speak. For a long moment, we simply listened to the thud of earth on wood. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice low enough that only I could hear. He never meant for you to find out like this. I flinched. The ground beneath me felt suddenly unsteady. Find out what? That he lived a double life? That I was a fool? Camille's eyes softened. That you were loved. By him. And by others you don't yet know.
The cryptic word hung between us like mist.
Others. I pressed. She hesitated, then glanced toward the tree line where a lone figure stood half hidden, a dark silhouette beneath the dripping branches. Not everyone who loved your father is here to mourn, she whispered. Some came to protect you. The figure shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if aware of our attention.
Maillat quickened. Camille's gaz, mais minons mort.
When the time is right, you'll understand. But you must be careful, because some secrets were buried long before today. Another spade of earth hit the coffin, the sound dull and final. I wanted to demand answers, to shake the truth from her, but the stranger beneath the trees vanished like smoke. And in that fleeting absence, I felt the weight of something larger than grief settling over me, a conspiracy of silence that had begun long before my father's final breath. The silhouette beneath the dripping oak vanished as if the woods themselves had swallowed it whole. For a heartbeat I wondered if grief had finally blurred my senses, if the storm and Camille's words had conjured a phantom. But the quickening of her breath told me she had seen the figure too. The last spade of earth hit my father's coffin with a damp, final thud. A murmur of prayers rose from the small crowd and drifted into the mist. The priest closed his book, umbrellas snapped open like dark wings as mourners began their slow retreat toward the church hall. Mother walked ahead, her arm looped through my cousin Henry's. She moved like a sleepwalker, her black veil a trembling shadow in the drizzle. I wanted to run to her to offer comfort, but my eyes kept sliding back to the tree line where the stranger had stood. Camille lingered beside me, her umbrella tilted so the rain spattered across her shoulder. Did you see him? She asked, her voice low enough to be drowned by the rustle of wet leaves. Yes, I whispered. Who was he? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Not here, she said. Something in her tone, urgent, almost pleading, halted the questions building on my tongue. The storm might have eased, but a darker tension now hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. Back inside the church hall, the scent of damp wool and bitter coffee mingled with lilies. People gathered around tables heavy with sandwiches and casseroles that no one seemed hungry for. Conversations floated like ghosts, fragmented, half-hearted condolences stitched together by curiosity. Such a shock. Never would have guessed. That woman, imagine. Each word felt like a pebble thrown at the fragile glass of my patience. Mother sat rigid in a corner chair, eyes fixed on the floor. I longed to shield her from the speculation, but I barely had the strength to shield myself. Camille appeared at my side once more. "Walk with me," she said.
Note à request, à qui commande.
We slipped through a side door and into the grey afternoon. The drizzle had thinned to a mist, and the old cemetery stretched beyond the churchyard like a forgotten kingdom of stone and moss. She led me down a narrow path bordered by leaning tombstones and gnarled oaks whose branches dripped with silver rain. Who was that man? I asked again once the church was out of sight. Camille stopped beneath a towering oak, its trunk twisted like the ribs of some ancient beast. She turned, and for the first time I saw fear flicker across her composed features. "Your father," she began, her voice trembling, "was not the man you think you buried today." I stiffened. "You've already made that clear." She shook her head. "No, you've only seen the smallest piece. There are others who knew him, in ways even I did not. The man in the trees is one of them." "Who is he?" "A friend. An old ally of sorts. Someone who carries truths too dangerous to be spoken in that church." My pulse thudded in my ears.
Dangereux?
My father was a schoolteacher. He read novels by the fire. What danger could there possibly be? Camille's gaze darted toward the woods, as if expecting the stranger to emerge at any moment. "He kept things from you not to betray you, but to protect you. There were agreements. Promises he made decades ago."
What kind of promise?
Her silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Finally she whispered, "Ones that could still cost lives if broken." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The father I'd known, gentle, methodical, predictable, was slipping through my memory like water through clenched fists. A sudden crack of a branch snapped our heads toward the trees. The silhouette reappeared, tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden by the low brim of a dark hat. He stepped forward with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged to the shadows.
Camille exhaled, à sound half relief, half dread.
"You shouldn't have come," she called softly. The man stopped a few paces away. Rain dripped from his coat. "And let him be buried without the truth?" His voice was deep, roughened by time. I took an involuntary step closer.
Who are you?
He lifted his head just enough for me to catch the glint of grey eyes beneath the brim. "A friend of your father's," he said.
Nemes Richard Hale.
"We served together." "Served?" I echoed.
In the army? My father never. Not the army you're thinking of, Richard interrupted.
His gaze sharpened. He was part of something quieter. Something that doesn't make history books. Camille's lips tightened.
Richard.
"She deserves to know," he said, cutting her off. "They'll come looking, Camille."
You can't hide her forever. My skin prickled.
"Hide me? From who?" Richard's eyes met mine, the grey of storm clouds heavy with unshed secrets. "Your father kept certain people at bay. People who believe you now carry what he once protected."
He shook my head.
"This is absurd."
Protected what?
Richard reached into his coat and drew out a small weathered envelope. He held it like an offering. "He left this for you. He told me to give it only when the earth closed over him." My fingers trembled as I took the envelope. My name, Clara, was written in my father's unmistakable hand. The sight of it nearly undid me. "Read it," Richard urged. The paper crackled as I opened it. Inside lay a single page, folded twice. My father's script flowed across it in careful strokes.
My dearest Clara.
If you are reading this, I have left you too soon. Forgive the years of silence about the work I once did. There are men who would twist truth into weapons. I kept secrets to keep you safe. Now they will turn their eyes to you. But you are not without allies.
Camille knows where to begin.
Richard will help you find the rest.
Trust no one beyond these two.
And Clara, remember what I always told you, the greatest courage is not in keeping secrets, but in knowing when to reveal them.
Your loving Vater. The word blurred a tears welled in my eyes.
Camille placed a gentle hand on my arm. I told you he loved you. Every decision he made was to protect you. But from what?
My voice cracked.
Richard's jaw tightened. From the same men who will notice his death. They'll want what he died guarding. The envelope slipped from my trembling hands, landing in the wet grass like a fallen leaf. Richard stooped, retrieved it, and pressed it back into my palm.
Keep it close. Tonight, you and he will talk.
Away from prying ears. Camille looked toward the distant church where mourners still lingered. We don't have much time. They'll suspect. They already do, Richard replied. His eyes found mine again, unwavering. Your father's secret is now your burden, whether you like it or not.
The sky darkened to the bruised purple of approaching night.
The oaks around us dripped like slow metronomes, each drop counting down to something I could not yet name. I thought of the life I'd lived until this morning, simple, predictable, safe. And I felt it crumble like the damp soil over my father's coffin. I clutched the letter as though it were a lifeline. The storm might have passed, but a new one was gathering, one born not of weather but of the hidden truths now pressing in on me.
Camille whispered, Clara, what will happen next, you must be brave.
For him.
For yourself.
Richard nodded once, solemn. The night will bring answers, and danger. As we turned back toward the church, a gust of wind stirred the oaks, and for a fleeting moment I swore I heard my father's voice in the rustling leaves, a warning, or perhaps a final blessing. Either way, there would be no turning back. The letter trembled in my hand long after Richard's words faded into the damp evening. I could still hear the echo of my father's warning. The greatest courage is not in keeping secrets, but in knowing when to reveal them.
Those words haunted me through the night.
Even as the last mourners drifted home and the church grew silent, their weight settled on my chest like a stone. Camille stayed near, her presence a quiet anchor, while Richard lingered at the edge of the shadows, an impatient sentinel waiting for my courage to catch up. We can't speak here, Richard said at last, voice low enough to blend with the sighing wind. Your father prepared a place for this moment.
Asaphaos.
He called it the refuge. You need to see it tonight. Camille nodded, her face pale beneath the dark umbrella. He kept it locked for decades, Clara. Only you can open it now. The ride to the refuge felt like traveling through another lifetime. Richard drove a mud-spattered jeep along a winding road that cut through hills draped in fog. The headlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, and each curve revealed only more shadow. Camille sat beside me in the back seat, her silence thick with unspoken memories. I wanted to ask her what she knew, how long she'd carried my father's secret, but the look in her eyes warned me that some truths could not be rushed. Finally, we turned onto a rutted lane lined with pines that whispered in the night air. At the end stood a weathered stone cottage, its windows dark, its chimney a silhouette against the clouded sky. It looked like a place time had forgotten, a house waiting for ghosts.
Richard killed the engine.
This was your father's, he said. Every inch of it. He built it after the work.
What work?
I pressed.
Aimé my gaze in the dim light.
Inside, you'll begin to understand. The front door resisted the key, as though testing my resolve. When it finally yielded, a smell of cedar and long cold ashes greeted us. Richard struck a match, lighting an oil lamp whose flame wavered like a nervous heart. The room was simple, a stone fireplace, bookshelves sagging under the weight of dust and time, a wooden table marked with years of quiet labor. But it was the far wall that drew me, a wall of locked cabinets, each iron latch stamped with my father's careful initials. Camille approached them with reverence. He told me these held the pieces of his past. But he swore only you could decide what to open. My father's letter burned in my pocket. I pulled it out, scanning the lines again, hoping for a hidden clue. Then I saw it, a faint indentation beneath the signature, almost invisible.
3 letters, etched in the paper like a ghost, C.H.R. Christopher.
I murmured. Richard's brow furrowed. That was his given name. He hated it. Went by Chris only with those he trusted most.
He traced the letters with my fingertip.
They aligned perfectly with one cabinet in the center of the wall.
My pulse quickened.
I pressed the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. A single photograph rested on top, my father in his youth, standing beside Richard and a third man I didn't recognize. All three wore suits, their eyes shadowed by the glare of a distant flash. I opened the journal. My father's script filled every page, dates, locations, names I'd never heard. But it wasn't until I reached the third page that the truth began to take shape. The Council of Meridian.
The word pulsed like a warning.
I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper, our task, to safeguard the Meridian Codex. A document whose knowledge, in the wrong hands, would tilt nations into chaos. My throat tightened.
What is this?
Some kind of spy novel. Richard's jaw hardened. It's no novel.
The Codex is real.
And your father helped hide it. That's what we served to protect. I looked up, stunned. Why would a schoolteacher, my father, be part of something like this? Richard stepped closer, his eyes glinting like steel. Because he wasn't just a schoolteacher. Before you were born, he worked for a quiet branch of the government, a network so secret it doesn't officially exist. The council formed when the Codex resurfaced. He was one of its most trusted keepers. The room seemed to shrink around me. My father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who quoted poetry at dinner, had lived a life of covert duty.
Camille spoke softly.
He never wanted this for you. But he knew the day might come when his burden became yours.
Thunder rumbled beyond the hills.
The oil lamp flickered. Richard's hand tightened on the back of a chair. They'll come for it, he said. Now that he's gone, they'll assume you know where the Codex is. I swallowed hard. But I don't. Richard's gaze bore into mine. That won't stop them.
A sudden crash outside made us all start. The sound of gravel shifting under heavy boots.
Richard doused the lamp in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. Through the window, I saw movement, a quick flash of a flashlight's beam slicing through the trees. They found us, Richard hissed. My heart pounded. Camille gripped my arm, her nails biting through my sleeve. Richard drew a pistol from beneath his coat.
Stay behind me. And what verra don't speak.
The front door shuddered as if struck by a heavy hand. A muffled voice called out, low and commanding, Christopher Hale's family.
We know you're inside. Open the door and no one get hurt.
The name, my father's true name, rolled through the night like a curse. Richard motioned us toward the back of the house. There's a cellar door. Go now. Camille and I moved as one, the floorboards creaking beneath our hurried steps. The cellar door groaned as Richard pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. Down, he whispered. I hesitated, clutching the journal to my chest.
Richard.
Go, he barked. We descended into the cold earth. The smell of damp stone and iron wrapped around us. Above, the front door splintered with a violent crack.
Camille pulled me deeper into the shadow, her breath ragged.
Your father warned us, she whispered. The moment he was gone, they would come. Footsteps thundered overhead.
Voices, tout, mebtri, searched the cottage.
Richard's voice rumbled faintly from above, firm and unyielding. You won't find what you're looking for. A sharp reply, then the heavy clatter of boots. Camille pressed a finger to her lips, urging silence. I clutched the journal so tightly the leather cut into my palms. Another crash. The sound of furniture overturned. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the house fell silent except for the slow drip of rain through the cracked windows. Finally, Richard descended the stairs, his face carved from shadow. They're gone, he said, though his voice carried no relief. For now. I exhaled a shudder I hadn't realized I'd been holding.
Richard's gaz locked on the journal in Mayan.
That, he said, is the only piece of the Codex they didn't already destroy. Your father risked everything to hide it. And now, his eyes hardened. Now it's yours to protect. The weight of the journal felt heavier than stone. In that moment, I understood the cost of the legacy my father had left me, a life no longer defined by quiet grief, but by a dangerous inheritance.
Camille touched my shoulder gently. Clara, this is only the beginning.
What he guarded, others would kill to claim.
Outside, the storm resumed, a steady rhythm like a warning drum.
I looked from Camille to Richard and then down at the journal. My father's secret world had become mine. And there would be no turning back. The storm outside was no longer a distant drum, it pounded the roof like a warning from the heavens. I held my father's journal tight against my chest, feeling the ridges of the leather dig into my palm as if it were trying to etch itself into my skin. Richard's face, half lit by the flickering lantern he just relit, looked carved from iron. "They'll be back," he said. "And next time they won't knock." My throat tightened. "Who are they?" He glanced at Camille before answering, his voice a low growl. "An offshoot of the Council. They call themselves the Severin Order. Years ago they were allies, until they decided the Codex should be used, not hidden. Your father stood in their way. Now they think you know where the rest of it lies."
Camille gripped the stair rail, her knuckle white. "We can't stay here, Clara."
"This house isn't safe anymore." Richard nodded. "There's a safe route through the old rail tunnels. If we move before dawn, we can reach the coast before they track us." The coast. The word conjured an image of cold waves smashing against black rocks, a fitting backdrop for the chaos that had swallowed my life. I forced myself to breathe. "So we just run?" Richard's grey eyes locked onto mine.
"We regroup."
"Your father left more than one breadcrumb. The journal is only part of the story." We packed in silence. Camille retrieved a weathered satchel from a cabinet, while Richard checked his pistol with brisk military efficiency.
He tucked the journal beneath my coat, the leather warm from my grip. When we stepped outside, the wind hit like a slap.
The sky was a churn of ink and lightning, the oaks writhing like restless giants. Rain soaked through my coat within seconds, but the storm could not drown the thunder of my heart. Richard led us to the jeep, but before we reached it, a sudden flash of headlights cut across the drive. A black sedan roared up the lane, its tires spitting gravel. "Down!"
Richard barked. We dove behind the stone wall bordering the cottage.
The sedan skidded to a halt. Two men spilled out, shadows against the lightning, their movements sharp and predatory.
Camille's breath hitched.
I held mine, my father's journal pressed against my chest like a shield. One of the men called out, voice cold and certain, "Christopher Hale's family. We know you have the journal. Hand it over, and no one gets hurt." Richard raised a finger to his lips, then whispered back. "Toward the rail path."
We crossed low, slipping through the dripping grass toward the woods.
The storm covered the sound of our steps, but every crack of a branch felt like a gunshot.
A beam of light swept across the yard. Too close.
"Over there," a voice shouted.
Richard spun, fearing a single shot. The crack split the night. The men ducked, we ran.
The woods closed around us, dark and slick with rain. Branches clawed at my coat as I stumbled after Richard and Camille. Lightning flared, illuminating the skeletal trunks, then plunged us back into blackness. Behind us, voices and footsteps gave chase. "This way," Richard hissed, veering toward a narrow ravine. We slid down a muddy slope into the gaping mouth of an old railway tunnel. Its stone arch loomed like the jaw of some ancient beast. Inside, darkness swallowed us whole. The only light came from Richard's small flashlight, a trembling circle that danced across wet stone.
Camille pressed close, her breath ragged.
"Are they following?"
Richard paused, listening.
Only the storm's muffled growl reached us. "Not yet," he said. "But they will." The tunnel stretched ahead, a ribcage of echoing stone. Water dripped from the ceiling in steady beats, like the ticking of an invisible clock. I clutched the journal tighter.
My father's neat script, hidden beneath the leather, suddenly felt like a live wire. Something dangerous enough to draw blood.
We walked for what felt like hours. My shoes squelched with every step, cold seeped through my bones. Finally, Richard stopped beside a rusted service door. He pried it open with a grunt, revealing a cramped maintenance room lit by a single dangling bulb. "We'll rest here," he said. "They'll expect we headed for the main station. We'll stay underground until first light." Camille sank onto an overturned crate, shivering. "How much longer can we keep running?" Richard's jaw tightened.
"Allons it takes."
I pulled the journal from my coat. The leather glistened with rain. Opening it again, I flipped past the early pages until a loose sheet slipped free. It was a map hand-drawn, the ink slightly smudged. Lines of coordinates curved across the page like veins. At the bottom, my father had written one word in bold strokes: lighthouse.
Ister datit, Atamring.
This is where he wanted me to go.
Richard Lind over my Schulde. HIS Eisdarkend.
The Meridian Lighthouse. Of course. It's where the Codex was first hidden before the council fractured. Camille whispered, but the Order will know that too. Richard nodded grimly. Then we must reach it first.
A distant clang échoait through the tunnel.
We froze.
Another clang, closer this time.
They've found the tunnel, Richard muttered. He snapped off the bulb, plunging the room into darkness. Out the back, he whispered. Now. We slipped through a narrow service corridor barely wide enough for one person. My shoulder brushed cold stone, water dripped onto my neck. Behind us, footsteps entered the main tunnel, slow and deliberate.
Camille squeezed my hand.
Her palm was ice. The corridor twisted sharply, ending in a grated exit that opened onto a ravine. Richard forced the grate aside, and we emerged into the wild night. The storm had moved closer to the coast. I could smell the salt of the sea. Lightning revealed the black silhouette of a lighthouse on a distant cliff, its beacon dark, like an eye closed in slumber. That's it, Richard said.
The final refuge.
But before we could move, a shout ripped through the night. The Order had found the grate. Run.
Richard barked.
The ground sloped steeply toward the shore, slick with rain and loose stones.
We half slid, half ran, the wind howling like a living thing.
The lighthouse grew larger with each desperate stride, its stone tower a lone sentinel against the raging sea.
Behind us, voices grew louder, closer. Camille stumbled.
I grabbed her arm, yanking her upright. Richard fired another shot into the darkness. A cry answered him, but the pursuit didn't falter. At last we reached the base of the lighthouse. The heavy wooden door loomed, banded in iron. Richard slammed his shoulder against it. It didn't budge. He cursed under his breath. Help me. Camille and I pushed. The door groaned, then gave way with a sudden crack. We tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The interior smelled of salt and ancient wood. Spiral stairs wound upward into blackness. Richard barred the door with a rusted iron beam. They won't stop, he said, breathing hard. We have minutes, maybe less. I opened the journal again, frantic for guidance. On the inside cover, hidden beneath the flap of leather, a final note waited. Clara, the Codex is within the light that guides the lost.
Trust the storm to show the way.
I read it aloud, my voice trembling. Richard looked up the staircase. The lamp room. We climbed, the steps slick with condensation. Wind howled through the tower's cracks, carrying the roar of the sea. At the top, the great lantern stood silent, its glass panels fogged with rain. Camille brushed away the moisture, revealing a small brass plate beneath the mechanism. 3 letters were engraved there, CHR, the same initials from the letter.
En shaking, he pressed the plate. A hidden compartment clicked open.
Inside lay a thin, ancient-looking manuscript bound in dark cloth, the Codex. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Camille whispered, "Your father kept it safe, all these years." But before I could speak, the sound of splintering would echoed from below. The Order had breached the door. Richard stepped between us and the staircase, pistol raised.
Clara, take the Codex and stay behind me. Whatever happens, you must protect it.
Lightning flooded the room with silver light, and in that flash I understood the true weight of my father's last words. This was no longer his secret. It was mine.